He picked the most critical all-hands meeting to turn me into his inspiring prop, convinced I would never see the smirk on his face. What he did not know was that I had regained my sight 3 weeks ago. As soon as he called me a burden, I decided to let the entire room witness who was actually holding the keys. My name is Cora Whitman. At 34 years old, most of the tech world knew me as the tragic shadow standing behind the brilliant CEO of Halcyon Atrium. 2 years ago, I was the proprietary architect of our media algorithms, the woman who built the data backbone of this company from a dusty garage server. Today, as I walked into the headquarters for the quarterly all-hands meeting, I was simply the blind wife, a charity case wrapped in designer silk. I tapped my white cane rhythmically against the polished concrete floor, allowing the security guard to guide me to the reserved seat in the front row. I wore oversized black sunglasses that covered the upper half of my face. To the hundreds of employees, investors, and board members filling the auditorium, these glasses hid eyes that had failed me after a catastrophic car accident. They were wrong. Thanks to a radically new, undisclosed corneal transplant procedure I had undergone 3 weeks ago in absolute secrecy, the darkness was gone. I could see the scuff marks on the stage. I could see the dust on the velvet ropes. And most importantly, I could see Graham. Graham Kessler stood in the spotlight, adjusting his cuffs. He looked impeccable. The very image of a tech visionary ready to secure $50 million in Series C funding. He needed to sell stability, loyalty, and humanity. I was his prop for all three. "Before we talk numbers," Graham said, his voice dropping an octave to that practiced tone of solemn empathy. "I want to acknowledge my rock. Cora, darling, could you stand up for a moment?" I gripped my cane and rose slowly. I kept my face blank, staring straight ahead through my dark lenses. I saw the room shift uncomfortably. Graham paced the stage, clicking a remote. A slide appeared behind him. It was not a revenue chart. It was a breakdown of my personal medical expenses. "Love is not free," Graham chuckled, feigning a self-deprecating smile. "It costs about $120,000 a year in specialized care. It costs sleepless nights. It costs focus. Some might call it a distraction from our bottom line." The air left the room. It was a calculated move. He was showing the investors that he was sacrificing his personal wealth and mental energy for me, making him look like a saint while simultaneously painting me as a financial drain. "But I pay it gladly," he continued, walking to the edge of the stage and looking down at the top of my head. "Even if she can no longer see the empire we built, even if she is limited." Through the tint of my glasses, my eyes darted across the room, taking in data I had been denied for 2 years. I saw Marcus, our CFO, refuse to look at the stage, his gaze buried in his tablet. I saw our general counsel, who knew the details of the trust funds, looking pale and sick. And then I saw the woman in the VIP section, Renee Vale, the new PR director. She was not looking at Graham with professional admiration. She was looking at me with a smirk that curled the corner of her red lips. Graham turned back to the crowd, his confidence peaking. "That is why. To streamline our operations for this next phase of growth, Cora will be formally stepping down from all remaining advisory capacities today. Let's face it," he laughed, a short, sharp sound. "She is just good for signing papers now." "Right. Honey." A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the junior staff, coerced by his authority. The humiliation was absolute. He had stripped me of my intellect and reduced me to a signature on a page. I felt the heat rise in my chest, but I did not let my hands tremble. I kept my grip on the cane steady. I offered a small, serene smile that did not reach my eyes behind the glass. "Good," I thought to myself, watching the arrogance radiate off him like heat waves. "You just chose the right stage to convict yourself. 2 years ago, the world did not fade to black gradually. It was extinguished in a violent metal-shredding instant. The police report called it a freak mechanical failure, a severed brake line on a dry, straight highway. I called it impeccable timing. The crash happened exactly 1 hour after I had printed a dossier containing 300 pages of internal audit logs. Intending to drive them to the district attorney, I woke up in the hospital with darkness wrapping my head like a shroud and Graham holding my hand, weeping for the cameras stationed just outside the door. Publicly, Graham played the role of the martyr husband to perfection. He gave interviews about sacrifice and unconditional love. But the moment the journalists left and the door clicked shut, the temperature in the room would drop. "You do not need to worry about the numbers anymore. Cora," he would say, his voice lacking any real warmth, smoothing the hair back from my forehead with a touch that felt more like he was checking for a pulse than offering comfort. "Just rest. You are damaged now. You existing is enough." It was a subtle way of making me feel small, of reducing the woman who had built the very architecture of his success into a piece of furniture. Before the darkness, I was not just a wife. I was the chief data architect of Halcyon Atrium. I wrote the code that tracked revenue streams. I designed the approval protocols for advertising contracts. I knew exactly how money flowed through the veins of the company because I had built the pipes myself. That was how I found the ghost contracts. 6 months before the accident, I noticed patterns in the ledger. Massive payments were being routed to media consulting firms that had no websites, no offices, and no employees. The money would circle through these vendors and vanish, likely returning to private offshore accounts. When I tried to trace it, the accident happened. Graham thought he had neutralized me. He relied heavily on our prenuptial agreement, a document as cold and sharp as a scalpel. It stated clearly that assets remained separate property unless legally commingled. He used it like a blade hanging over my neck, constantly reminding me that the penthouse, the cars, and the stocks were his, and I lived in his world by his grace. However, arrogance makes men careless. A year before the crash, I had convinced Graham that our primary residence and the vacation estate needed to be moved into a holding limited liability company to protect us from frivolous lawsuits. I drafted the papers, I set up the structure. Graham, busy chasing his Series B funding, signed the transfer documents without reading a single page. He assumed it was just another administrative task I was handling for him. He never noticed that the managing member of that holding company, the person with sole authority to sell, lease, or eviction power, was me. For 2 years, I lived in the dark, but while my eyes were useless, my other senses sharpened into weapons. I memorized the acoustics of our home. I learned to tell the difference between the heavy tread of Graham's shoes when he was angry and the light, bouncing step he used when he had just closed a deal. I cataloged his breathing patterns. I knew the exact pitch his voice hit when he was lying. "I have to work late tonight. Cora, just a few strategy meetings," he would say, his breath catching slightly on the last word. I would nod, tapping my cane, while smelling the faint, cloying scent of Renee's perfume clinging to his jacket. I did not scream. I did not throw vases. I did not want a dramatic confrontation that he could spin into a story about my mental instability. I wanted a clean, surgical extraction of the truth. I wanted an ending that looked like a court verdict, undeniable evidence followed by irreversible consequences. I sat in the dark, listening to him build his lie, waiting for the moment I could open my eyes and burn it down. "If they believe the blind see nothing," I whispered to the empty room, "then I will let them reveal themselves right under the lights." 3 weeks ago, under the guise of visiting a specialist for vision therapy, I traveled to a private medical center in Portland. I paid in cash to ensure no insurance alert would ping Graham's phone. I demanded a total blackout on my medical records. When the bandages were removed, the world rushed back in sharp, painful clarity. The doctor offered me a mirror to see my healed eyes, but I pushed it away. I did not care what I looked like. I needed to see what I owned. The moment I returned home, while Graham was at the office, I walked straight to the wall safe in his study. I keyed in the combination he had never bothered to change. The heavy steel door swung open. I did not look for jewelry or love letters. I pulled out the stack of legal binders labeled with the company logo. What I found made my blood run cold. There were addendums to commercial contracts dated from the last 6 months, all bearing my signature. I held the paper up to the light. To a casual observer, the signature was perfect. However, I knew the weight of my own hand. The pen strokes were too even, lacking the slight hesitation on the capital letter that I had developed over a decade of signing checks. The pressure points were wrong. Someone had traced my signature onto these documents using a light box or a digital overlay machine. I needed to know who was moving the pieces. I dusted off my old laptop, a machine Graham thought was obsolete, and reconnected to the network. My access was technically revoked, but I had built the system, and I knew where the back doors were. I set up a Honey inbox and a Honey drive. These were decoy folders labeled personal asset transfers and offshore accounts. They looked like treasure chests to a thief, but in reality, they were digital mousetraps. Any attempt to open them would log the user's IP address, device ID, and physical location without them knowing. It took less than 4 hours for the trap to snap shut. The logs showed a user accessing the decoy drive from a workstation inside the Halcyon Atrium Executive Suite. I traced the credentials. It was not Graham. It was Renee Vale. The new public relations director had administrative privileges that far exceeded her job description. She was not just writing press releases. She was accessing the root directory of our financial agreements. I dug deeper into the files she had been viewing. I found a brand ambassador agreement worth $2 million per year, payable to a shell company. Attached to the contract was a personal guarantee clause. My name was listed as the guarantor. I read the fine print, my breath hitching in my throat. The clause stated that in the event of a default or bankruptcy by Halcyon Atrium, the guarantor would be personally liable for the full debt. You utter bastard, I whispered to the empty room, my finger tracing the fabricated signature on the screen. Graham and Renee were not just stealing from the company. They were setting up an exit strategy where they kept the cash, and I was left with the debt. If the company failed, which seemed likely given the ghost contracts, creditors would come for my personal assets, bypassing the corporate shield because of this guarantee. I knew I could not trust a cloud server alone. I initiated a 3-layer backup protocol. First, I printed every incriminating document and had them notarized at a UPS store 3 towns over. Second, I downloaded the entire server log to an air-gapped hard drive that I taped underneath the drawer of my vanity. Third, I uploaded an encrypted zip file to a dead drop server that would auto-publish to 5 major news outlets if I did not enter a code every 48 hours. Once the data was secure, I picked up a burner phone and dialed a number I had memorized years ago. Daphne Cross. She was the most aggressive litigator in the city, a woman who treated courtrooms like gladiatorial arenas. She answered on the second ring. "This is Cross." "Daphne, it is Cora Whitman," I said, my voice steady for the first time in years. "Cora." There was a pause, a moment of genuine shock. "My God, I heard about everything. Graham says you are not doing well. Graham is a liar." I cut in. "I need to retain you, immediately, and I need you to bring a forensic accountant." "Okay," Daphne said, her tone shifting instantly from sympathy to professional sharpness. "Tell me what you want. Do you want a settlement? A divorce? A win? No." "Daphne," I said, staring at the forged signature that was meant to ruin me. "I don't need a win. I need the whole truth to stand up in court." While I sat in the home office constructing a fortress of evidence, Graham was out in the world polishing his halo. He ramped up his campaign to win over the investors before the valuation deadline, painting himself as the saintly husband carrying the weight of a disabled wife. It was sickeningly effective. The stock price ticked up every time he gave a somber interview about resilience and family values. Renee Vale was the architect of this new narrative. I listened to her voice on the local news, smooth and practiced, spinning my tragedy into a marketing hook. She pitched stories to tech blogs describing me as a silent inspiration to the company, a mascot for overcoming adversity. It was a brilliant strategy to distract the market from the rumors of financial mismanagement. If everyone was looking at the brave, blind wife, no one was looking at the hollowed-out balance sheets. At home, however, the mask slipped completely. I have removed your access to the joint checking and savings accounts. Cora, Graham said one evening, tossing his keys onto the counter with a heavy clatter. He did not even look at me. You nearly overdrew the account last week with those medical bills. From now on, I handle the money. Do not interfere with my work. I stood by the kitchen island, gripping the edge of the marble. I could see him perfectly. He was checking his reflection in the microwave door, fixing a stray lock of hair. I feel so useless. Graham, I said, forcing a tremor into my voice. I fumbled for my phone and held it out to him with a shaking hand. Could you just read this email for me? It is from the bank. I think I missed a notification. Graham sighed, a loud, exaggerated exhalation of annoyance. He snatched the phone from my hand. I watched his eyes scan the screen. I saw the moment he realized it was a benign notification about a policy update. He relaxed, his arrogance returning. It is nothing, Cora. Just spam, he muttered, tossing the phone back onto the counter. Then, he leaned in, his voice dropping to a patronizing whisper. Stop worrying your pretty little head about details. You are not equipped for it anymore. Just sign a few papers when I tell you to, and everything will be fine. My heart hammered against my ribs. There it was. He had just admitted that my signature was his tool. He needed my hand to validate his fraud. Later that afternoon, Renee arrived at the house for a strategy session. I sat in the living room, staring blankly at a wall while they worked at the dining table. They thought I was in my own world. I watched them over the rim of my sunglasses. When Graham made a joke about a competitor, Renee laughed too hard. She reached out and squeezed his forearm, her fingers lingering on the fabric of his sleeve for 3 seconds too long. It was not a professional gesture. It was a claim of ownership. And Graham did not pull away. He leaned into it. Graham, Renee said, her voice low. What about the loose end? The mechanic handled, Graham replied, glancing at me briefly. Seeing me motionless, he turned back to her. Jimmy at the garage took care of the logs. The brake failure report is solid. No one will ever look twice at that car. The air in the room seemed to freeze. I kept my breathing shallow, my face a mask of vacuous calm. Jimmy. The garage. My mind raced back to the accident report. The car had been serviced 2 days before the crash at a high-end shop, but the invoice had been subcontracted. I had never looked at the subcontractor's name until now. I waited until they went out to the patio for a smoke break. I moved silently to the table and glanced at the file Graham had left open. There was an invoice from Vantage Auto, owned by James Jimmy Rourke Graham's college roommate. The accident was not an accident. It was a hit. I felt a surge of nausea, but I swallowed it down. I could not scream. I could not flip the table. If I confronted them now, here, in private, it would be my word against theirs. They would claim I was hysterical, paranoid, broken. I needed them to slip up where it counted. I needed an audience. I retreated to my room before they returned. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened my laptop, creating a new folder for the evidence I had just gathered. I typed in a name for the operation, Project Lighthouse. I whispered to the screen. I chose the name because a lighthouse does not attack the storm. It simply shines a light so powerful that the hidden rocks are revealed, and I was going to turn the light on exactly when they thought they were safest in the dark. Daphne Cross did not believe in small measures. Sitting in her office, She laid out a strategy that was less like a lawsuit and more like a tactical demolition. We established a two-front war. The first front was civil, attacking the division of assets and the validity of the prenuptial agreement based on coercion. The second front was criminal. We were compiling a dossier on forgery, wire fraud, and unauthorized access to protected data systems. We selected the detonation point with precision. It would be the quarterly leadership summit next Tuesday. It was the only day of the year when the entire board of directors, the major shareholders, and the external auditors would be in the same room at the same time. To ensure the physical safety of the event, I retained Harborline Executive Security. I needed a team that could secure a perimeter without causing a scene. I paid them a retainer of $15,000 to be on standby in the lobby, instructing them to intervene only if I gave a specific hand signal. While Daphne drafted the motions, I began seeding the clouds. I prepared a sanitized packet of financial discrepancies just enough to raise questions without showing my full hand and had it couriered to Miles Rourke. Miles was a board member who had always been skeptical of Graham's rapid expansion plans. I knew that once he saw the irregularities in the marketing budget, he would arrive at the summit looking for blood. Back at the house, I turned our home into a recording studio. Since the property was technically owned by the holding limited liability company that I managed, I had every legal right to install security cameras in the common areas for asset protection. I placed high-definition cameras in the crown molding of the living room and the study. Graham watched me moving boxes in the hallway, assuming I was finally accepting my defeat and preparing to move out. He leaned against the doorframe, sipping scotch, his guard completely down. "Make sure you take all your trash with you, Cora," he said, gesturing loosely with his glass. "I am going to have the locks changed on Wednesday. I want a fresh start. No reminders of the past." I continued folding clothes, keeping my head down to hide the sharp, focused look in my eyes. He had no idea. I had reviewed the LLC paperwork that morning. The operating agreement contained an automatic renewal clause for the manager position if no objection was filed 90 days prior to expiration. Graham, in his arrogance, had never filed the objection. My management rights and my legal control over the house had quietly extended for another 36 months. He was evicting himself. Then, the final piece of the trap fell into place. Renee Vale arrived with champagne, flushed with the excitement of the upcoming summit. She wanted to celebrate early. Graham. "We should do a live stream tonight," Renee chirped, setting up her ring light in the middle of our living room. "A fireside chat about the future of Halcyon. It will hype up the investors before the meeting tomorrow." I paused in the hallway, listening. A live stream. They were going to broadcast their arrogance to the world in real time. It was better than any wiretap. I retreated to the guest room and pulled out my burner phone. I typed a message to Daphne. "They are throwing a party." I wrote, "I do not need them to apologize. I need them to say the truth out loud before I put it on the table." The night before the summit, the silence in our house was heavy, broken only by the hum of the central air conditioning and the rhythmic tapping of Graham's pacing in the study. I sat in the adjacent hallway, shrouded in shadow, leaning my head back against the wall as if resting. To anyone passing by, I was the exhausted, invalid wife. In reality, my eyes were wide open, fixed on the sliver of light spilling from the slightly ajar door. Graham was on the phone. His voice was low, but carried the sharp edge of urgency. "Look, just have the statement ready to go by noon," Graham said, pausing as he listened to the voice on the other end. No, not depression. Call it early onset cognitive decline. Stress-induced psychosis. I don't care what the medical term is. Just make sure the headlines say she is unstable. He was scripting my destruction. He hung up and walked out of the room, heading toward the kitchen to refill his drink. The moment he was out of sight, I moved. I slipped into the study, my movements silent on the plush carpet. On his mahogany desk sat a single sheet of paper titled Crisis Management: The Whitman Narrative. It was a bulleted list of lies designed to discredit me. including fabricated incidents of public outbursts and memory loss. It was detailed, cruel, and chillingly thorough. I did not touch the paper. I did not want to leave fingerprints or disturb the alignment. Instead, I pulled my phone from my pocket and snapped 3 high-resolution photos, ensuring the timestamp and the GPS location were embedded in the metadata. I wanted proof that this was premeditated, a calculated smear campaign rather than a reaction to a tragedy. I retreated to the shadows just as Graham returned. He did not sit down. Instead, he moved to the family computer in the corner of the room. I watched through the crack in the door as he typed in my email address. He was paranoid, checking to see if I had sent anything to the board. He typed in a password he had installed on my devices months ago. The screen flashed. He thought he was accessing my sent folder. In reality, he had just triggered the Honey inbox. The system instantly logged his unauthorized access, recording his keystrokes and the exact time he violated my privacy. He scrolled for a minute, finding nothing but the dummy emails I had planted about doctor appointments and grocery lists. He exhaled, relieved, and closed the browser. Later that evening, the blue light of a ring lamp flooded the living room. Renee and Graham were live streaming to the company's internal social channel, a pep talk for the employees before the big day. I stood in the kitchen doorway, just out of the frame, watching them perform. Renee was glowing, answering questions from the chat with a practiced ease. Then, a comment popped up on the screen about the new brand ambassador contract and the risk involved. Renee laughed, tossing her hair back. "Oh, please, the risk is minimal. Besides, we have a solid personal guarantee backing it. Don't worry about the legal side. She signed it already." My breath caught. It was a slip, a tiny, fatal slip. By saying, "She signed it already," while knowing I had been blind and unable to read the document. She was admitting on a recorded stream that she knew about the signature. If I was blind, I could not have knowingly signed it without it being read to me, which meant she was either admitting to coercion or admitting to the forgery. I immediately clipped the segment and forwarded it to Daphne. Her reply came 30 seconds later. "That is the nail. Tomorrow he burns the bridge." I went upstairs to my dressing room. I locked the door and turned on the bright vanity lights. For the first time in 2 years, I looked at myself in the mirror. I did not see the victim Graham described. I saw a woman with sharp eyes and a set jaw. I did not apply makeup to look beautiful. I applied it like war paint, sharpening the angles of my face, hiding the fatigue. I reached into the back of my drawer and pulled out a silver USB drive. It contained everything the forensic analysis of the forged signatures, the audit trails of the ghost contracts, the logs of Graham's illegal access, and the video of Renee's admission. I placed it in my purse next to my folding cane. I turned off the lights, plunging the room back into darkness. "Tomorrow," I whispered to the empty air, "people will know I am not blind." I was just silent. The morning of the quarterly leadership summit arrived with the tension of a drawn bowstring. Graham stood at the podium in the main auditorium, looking every inch the master of the universe in a bespoke navy suit that cost $5,000. Renee Vale sat in the front row, positioned slightly to his right, beaming up at him like a victorious general's consort. They exuded the confidence of people who believed they had already won. I arrived 15 minutes late by design. The heavy double doors swung open, and the rhythmic clack-clack-clack of my white cane against the hardwood floor cut through the hushed room. I wore my dark glasses and a simple black dress. I felt the collective gaze of 200 people shift from the stage to me. I sensed Graham's irritation from across the room, but he masked it quickly with a tight, benevolent smile. I found my seat in the front row, keeping my head lowered, letting him believe I was nothing more than a disruption he could manage. Graham resumed his speech, his voice booming with practiced sincerity. "At Halcyon Atrium, we believe that transparency is our currency," Graham said, spreading his arms wide. "We owe it to our shareholders to be as open about our challenges as we are about our victories. Responsibility is not just a word on a slide. It is the foundation of this family. The room erupted in polite, obligatory applause. Graham nodded, soaking it in. He signaled for the Q&A session to begin, expecting the usual softball questions about growth projections and market share. Instead, Miles Rourke, the board member I had anonymously briefed, stood up in the third row. He did not look at Graham. He looked at a file in his hands. "Graham," Miles said, his voice carrying without a microphone, "I am looking at a brand ambassador contract in the appendix. It is secured by a personal guarantee against the Whitman Family Trust. The liability is massive. Did your wife sign off on leveraging her personal inheritance for this?" Graham did not flinch. He was a professional liar. He leaned into the microphone, his expression softening into one of patronizing reassurance. "An excellent question. Miles, yes. Cora and I discussed this at length. She understands the vision. She agreed that we need to be all in. I have her full support." I stood up. I did not need the cane to stand, but I leaned on it for effect. The room went deadly quiet. "I did not sign it," I said. My voice was not loud, but it was clear, stripping the air from the room. Graham laughed, a nervous, jagged sound. He stepped away from the podium and walked to the edge of the stage, looking down at me with faux concern. "Cora, darling, please sit down. You are confused. We talked about this last week. The medication. It makes your memory hazy sometimes." He turned to the audience, shrugging helplessly. She does not always see things clearly, literally or figuratively." I did not argue. I did not scream. I simply smiled, a small, cold curvature of my lips. I raised my phone, which was already connected to the boardroom's audio-visual Bluetooth network, a connection I had established the moment I walked in. "If I am so confused," I said, tapping the screen, "then perhaps we should listen to someone who is not—" The massive screen behind Graham flickered. The slide about fiscal responsibility vanished, replaced by the video I had recorded the previous night. It was the live stream capture. Graham's face on the screen was relaxed, holding a drink. Renee's voice rang out through the auditorium speakers, amplified and undeniable. "Don't worry about the legal side. She signed it already." Then, Graham's voice followed, clear as a bell. "I keep her in check with paper. As long as she thinks she is helpless. She signs what I put in front of her." The audio echoed in the stunned silence of the auditorium. On stage, the color drained from Graham's face so fast he looked like a corpse. Renee gasped, her eyes darting around the room. She realized the implication instantly. She jumped up from her seat, reaching for the AV console on the side table. "Turn it off," Renee shrieked, losing all composure. It is a deepfake. Turn it off." She lunged toward me, perhaps intending to grab the phone, but she never made it. 2 agents from Harborline Executive Security stepped out from the shadows of the wings, blocking her path with professional, impassive walls of muscle. I remained standing, still looking straight ahead, my sunglasses reflecting the chaos on stage. To them, I was still the blind wife who had stumbled onto a button. Graham gripped the podium, his knuckles white. He needed to regain control. He needed to dominate the narrative before it spiraled. He leaned into the microphone, his voice dropping into a guttural growl that vibrated with rage. "Enough," he roared. "This is a technical glitch. I am the CEO. I am the one who decides what is real in this company." He was shouting at the storm, unaware that the lightning had already struck. The double doors at the back of the auditorium swung open with a heavy thud that reverberated against the back wall. Daphne Cross marched down the center aisle, her heels clicking with the precision of a metronome. She did not look at the stunned audience. She walked straight to the stage and slapped a thick packet of documents onto the podium, right over Graham's trembling hands. "Mr. Kessler, you have been served," Daphne announced, her voice projecting clearly to the back row. This is a temporary restraining order on all liquid assets associated with Halcyon Atrium and the Kessler Family Trust, along with a mandatory preservation order for all digital evidence. Graham stared at the papers, his face flushing a deep, violent red. He laughed, but it sounded wet and desperate. He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a folded copy of our prenuptial agreement, which he carried like a talisman. "This is a waste of paper, Ms. Cross," Graham sneered, waving the document in her face. "My prenup is ironclad. Whatever she thinks she is entitled to, she gets nothing. The house, the cars, the accounts are in my name. She is just a charity case I took in." Daphne did not blink. She simply adjusted her glasses. "Your prenup protects assets that are titled to you, Mr. Kessler. The problem is, very little is actually titled to you anymore." I reached into my bag and pulled out the binder I had retrieved from the safe. I slid it across the smooth table toward the independent auditor sitting in the front row. 2 years ago," I said, my voice cutting through the tension. "You signed a transfer agreement to move our primary residence and the vehicle fleet into a holding company for liability protection. You signed it without reading it because you were too busy chasing your Series B funding." Graham froze. I saw the memory flickering behind his eyes. That means nothing," he stammered, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. "I own the company. I am the owner. Actually," I corrected him softly, "you are the tenant. The operating agreement lists me as the sole manager with executive control, and there is a termination clause. Any tenant engaging in fraud or criminal activity on the premises forfeits their lease immediately." A low murmur rippled through the room. The investors were whispering. Graham looked like he had been punched in the gut. The lead investor from the venture capital firm, a man who controlled 40% of the voting shares, stood up. His face was grim. "We need to suspend the CEO immediately," he stated, pointing a finger at the stage. "We cannot have a tenant facing fraud charges running this valuation. The risk is too high." Renee Vale saw the ship sinking and decided to jump. She stepped away from Graham, holding her hands up in a gesture of surrender. "I had nothing to do with the financial side," she cried out, her voice shrill. "I just wrote the press releases Graham told me to. He told me the signatures were real. I was just following orders." Daphne pulled a single sheet of paper from her folder and held it up. "Ms. Vale, this is an email log from your personal account sending the forged brand ambassador contract to the lender," Daphne said coldly. "The timestamp is 3 a.m. You were not following orders. You were executing the fraud." Renee collapsed back into her chair, covering her face with her hands. Graham looked around the room, his eyes wild. He saw his empire crumbling in real time. He turned back to the audience, pointing a shaking finger at me. "She is crazy," he screamed, his voice cracking. "Do not listen to her. The accident, it scrambled her brain. She imagines things I signed those papers. Me, she is just a jealous, blind invalid trying to ruin me." I did not flinch at his insults. I placed my hand flat on the table. "Check the signature," I said to the auditor. "Compare the pressure points on the ambassador contract with the sample you have on file from before my accident." The auditor, a stern man with no patience for drama, opened the folder. He pulled out a magnifying glass. The room held its breath for 30 seconds. It felt like an hour. Finally, the auditor looked up. He did not look at Graham. He looked at the board members. "The signatures do not match." The auditor declared, "The pressure distribution is artificial. It is a digital trace, not a wet signature." The silence in the room shattered. It was replaced by the sound of chairs scraping back and angry voices rising. The shareholders were not looking at Graham with admiration anymore. They were looking at him like he was a radioactive isotope that needed to be contained. Graham stood alone at the podium. He looked at the crowd, then at Renee, and finally at me. He realized his perfect public relations strategy had just become his indictment. This is a mistake," Graham whispered. but the microphone caught it, broadcasting his fear to everyone he had tried to impress. The chaos in the auditorium was deafening, but Graham did not stay to face the music. He seized my upper arm, his grip bruising and desperate, and dragged me forcefully through the side exit into the sterile, empty hallway. The heavy door clicked shut behind us, muffling the roar of the shareholders into a dull hum. He pinned me against the wall, his breathing ragged and shallow. His face was inches from mine, sweating and distorted by panic. He still believed, even now, that he was dealing with a cripple. "You blind, ungrateful. What do you think you are doing?" Graham hissed, shaking me slightly. "You think you can play games with my company? You know nothing. You live in the dark." That was the moment I decided to turn the lights on. I reached up slowly and removed my oversized black sunglasses. I folded them and tucked them into my clutch. Then, for the first time in 2 years, I looked directly into his eyes. I let my pupils contract in the harsh fluorescent light of the hallway. I focused on the dilated terror in his own gaze. "I do not live in the dark anymore." "Graham," I said, my voice calm and steady. "I see you shaking. I see Renee standing behind the door, terrified, and I see you lying." Graham stumbled back as if I had physically struck him. He looked at my eyes, tracking his movement, and the realization hit him like a physical blow. The ghost he had been haunting was suddenly staring back. You can see," he stammered, his arrogance crumbling into disbelief. How long have you been watching me? Long enough to know that Jimmy at Vantage Auto did not just fix the brakes." I replied cold. The color drained from his face completely. He looked like a cornered animal. In his panic, his filter disintegrated. "That accident! It was supposed to stop this!" he yelled, his voice cracking. It should have silenced you for good. You were supposed to stay broken." The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. He realized what he had just said. He had just confessed that the crash was not a mechanical failure, but a designed outcome. I pointed a finger toward the ceiling corner behind him. "Smile, Graham," I said. "The security feed in this hallway records audio." Before he could react, the side door burst open again. Renee rushed out, her heels clattering on the tile. She looked frantic. She grabbed Graham's arm, trying to pull him toward the elevator. "Graham, shut up!" "We stick to the script," Renee shrieked, her eyes wide with fear. "The report said mechanical failure. Do not say another word." I watched them, feeling a cold detachment. Renee knew the script. That meant she knew about the crash. She knew about the attempt on my life. I did not scream for help. I pulled out my phone and dialed Daphne. "Daphne," I said, keeping my eyes locked on Graham. "Add possible obstruction of justice and malicious intent to the filing. And I want an immediate motion to seize his personal devices." He just admitted the car crash was intentional on camera. Graham's legs seemed to give out. He slumped against the wall, the fight leaving him instantly. He switched tactics, pivoting from aggression to pathetic manipulation. He reached out a trembling hand toward me. "Cora, baby, please," he whimpered, tears forming in his eyes. "I was under so much pressure. Think about us. Think about how I took care of you. I fed you. I bathed you when you could not move. You used to need me. I looked at the hand that had signed away my life, the hand that had likely paid for the sabotage of my car. No, Graham," I said. "I never needed you. I needed the truth." Renee stepped between us, desperate to salvage something from the wreckage. She opened her purse, her hands shaking so badly she dropped a lipstick. "Listen, Cora, we can fix this," Renee pleaded, her voice rapid and breathless. "We have liquidity in the offshore accounts. We can wire you $500,000 right now. Just walk away. Let us leave." I laughed. a dry, humorless sound. "You still do not get it." "Renee," I said, stepping back toward the auditorium door. "Money does not make my signature appear on those papers, and money does not fix brake lines." I turned my back on them. I walked back toward the meeting room, where the board was waiting for answers. My stride was strong. I knew now that the knot at the center of this mess was not just infidelity or fraud. It was a conspiracy to bury me, and I was about to hand them the shovel. I walked back into the boardroom with the steady, measured pace of an executioner. The atmosphere inside had shifted from confusion to cold, hard judgment. Graham followed me in, looking disheveled and frantic, but the moment he crossed the threshold, he seemed to realize the ground had shifted beneath him. The chairman of the board did not even look up from the documents Daphne had distributed. He simply tapped his pen against the mahogany table. "The board has reviewed the preliminary evidence," the chairman stated, his voice devoid of the warmth he had shown Graham just an hour ago. "We have just concluded an emergency vote. Graham, you are suspended from your role as CEO, effective immediately, pending a full forensic investigation." Graham opened his mouth to protest, but the head of security stepped forward. "Your access badge has been deactivated remotely. Mr. Kessler, you are unauthorized to access any company terminals from this second forward." Daphne Cross stood up, smoothing her suit jacket. She held up a flash drive. "We are also serving a preservation order for the main server," she announced. "We have logs of unauthorized access into a restricted Honey inbox on Mrs. Kessler's private drive. The IP address matches the CEO's terminal. That constitutes federal wire fraud and unauthorized computer access." Graham looked around the room, sweat pouring down his face. He was losing them, and he knew it. He tried to pivot back to the narrative of my incompetence. "You cannot do this based on the word of a bitter woman," Graham shouted, pointing a shaking finger at me. "She is manipulating you. I control the voting block. You cannot hold this meeting without my consent." I stepped forward, placing a single yellowed document on the table. "Actually, Graham, you forgot something," I said softly. "The voting rights for your initial shares are held by the Kessler Family Trust. You never dissolved it because you wanted the tax break, and the trustee of that fund is me." The room went silent. Graham stared at the document, his eyes bulging. "I am exercising my proxy rights," I declared, looking him dead in the eye. "I vote in favor of the suspension. The motion carries." Graham snapped. He lunged toward the table, his hand clawing for the papers, a guttural sound of rage tearing from his throat. "No, you! Give me that," he screamed. He never made it to the table. The agents from Harborline Executive Security moved with the speed and precision of a steel trap. They did not strike him. They simply stepped in his path, creating an immovable wall of bodies. One agent firmly gripped Graham's wrist, immobilizing him. "Please step back, sir," the agent said, his voice calm but threatening. "Do not make this a police matter right now." To the side, Renee Vale was crumbling. An IT officer approached her, holding out a plastic bin. "Ms. Vale, please surrender your company phone and laptop," the officer requested. Renee burst into tears, her composure shattering completely. She handed over the devices, her hands trembling violently. She realized she had no leverage, no narrative, and no protector. She was just an accomplice with a paper trail. I can explain," Renee sobbed, looking at the board members who refused to meet her gaze. "He made me do it. I have emails." I ignored her and turned my full attention to the man who had been my husband. He stood there, held back by guards, stripped of his title, his reputation, and his power. "You used my blindness to hide your crimes." "Graham," I said, my voice steady and carrying to every corner of the room. "You thought I was a prop. You thought I was a burden. But I saw it all, and I saved every single bite." Graham opened his mouth, but no words came out. The guards turned him around and escorted him toward the exit. The walk was long. The investors, the employees, and the people who had applauded him earlier now stared at their shoes or checked their phones. The silence was suffocating. It was the sound of a legacy dying. When the doors clicked shut behind him, the tension in the room broke. The board members began to murmur, organizing the next steps with Daphne. I did not join them. I stood alone at the head of the table. I placed my white cane on the polished wood. I reached up and removed my dark glasses, folding them neatly beside the cane. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out at the city skyline. Sharp and bright and full of color. Power is not the loudest voice in the room. I whispered to the reflection in the glass. Power is the truth. Signed by the right person. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please leave a comment down below and share your thoughts on Cora's revenge. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit that hype button so this story can be heard by even more people. See you in the next drama.